Welcome again to Newcastle Family History Society podcasts. The Newcastle Family History Society, located on Awabakal land in Newcastle, New South Wales, Australia, provides support for those interested in family history. Today, Jane Ison will share a short biography about her ancestors, Elijah Abell and his wife, Margaret Brown. The couple had arrived separately in Australia. They met in Newcastle, married, and eventually settled in Wallsend, where Elijah played an important part in civic affairs. Jane will talk about the hidden aspects of lives that can be uncovered by using DNA and how ancestral lines can be confirmed or not.
Elijah Abell and Margaret Brown were my 2 times great-grandparents. Both arrived from England during the 1850s and had settled in Wallsend, New South Wales, by the early 1860s. Elijah was the first known member of the Abell family to arrive as an immigrant to Australia from Hege, the small village in Derbyshire, England, at about the age of 25. His arrival prompted further immigration of many of his immediate family, including his father, who was also from Hege and born in about 1806. Elijah was also believed to have been responsible for standardising the spelling of the family surname so that it ended with a double L, likely to distinguish his Abell family from the family of another Thomas Abell, born in 1846 and died in 1920, who was also living in Wallsend and who had arrived from Scotland. Elijah was the youngest son of Thomas Abell, born in 1806 and died in Wallsend in 1880, and Susanna Bland, born in 1805 and died in 1860, and was born on the 22nd of May, 1832. At this point in history, the men of the Abell family were generally working as coal miners in the English Midlands. Life was harsh in England at this time, and in 1832 it is almost certain that Elijah's paternal uncle John Abell was transported to Tasmania. In 1839, his maternal uncle William Bland was probably the man executed in Derby for his involvement in a house robbery that resulted in the death of the homeowner. Elijah's grandfather Thomas, his uncle William, and his father Thomas had all spent periods of time in Derby jail. The origins of this Abell family have not yet been able to be verified with DNA before about 1806, which, as a family researcher using DNA, is a concern. By 1854, Elijah had begun a relationship with 19-year-old Emma Gratian, as in that year a daughter, registered as Jane Gratian, was born. Elijah accepted that Jane was his child, and DNA has since confirmed the relationship. 2 years passed, and in August 1856, 23-year-old Elijah Abell and 21-year-old Emma Gratian married in Chesterfield, Derbyshire. Both were residents of the nearby area known as Stone Gravels. It is unknown why no family members witnessed the marriage, and it may be that either or both their families disapproved of the match. A short time after they married, and while Emma was pregnant with their second child, Elijah left Emma and Jane, although it is thought that he was probably still living in England. At the end of 1856, Emma and Jane Abell were admitted to Babington Workhouse, where on the 21st of January 1857, Elijah's son Joseph was born. Whether Elijah deliberately intended to abandon his pregnant wife and his daughter cannot ever be known. In a letter written by Sarah Jane Abell, Elijah's youngest daughter, to her brother Thomas, Sarah Jane said that her father had initially intended to seek gold in America, but when he reached Manchester to visit his sister Lydia, they spoke about gold discoveries in Australia. Elijah then seems to have changed his plans to make the far longer voyage to Australia. With his friend George Stone, Elijah left Hege and boarded the clipper ship Red Jacket, which left Liverpool on the 20th of March 1857. The two men arrived in Melbourne, Victoria, on the 8th of June 1857. On the 25th of May 1857, 2 months after Elijah left England and while he was still at sea, Babington Workhouse recorded that Emma Abell had died. If he knew of Emma's death at all, Elijah would not have known until well after his arrival in Australia. The little boy Joseph Abell was to die in Babington Workhouse in December 1862 at the age of 6. After both her parents disappeared from her life, Jane, now permanently called Gratian, was cared for by her maternal grandparents. The DNA of her descendants shows that she eventually emigrated to the United States, settled, and raised a family. From Melbourne, Elijah and George followed the gold diggings for 15 months in both Victoria and in New South Wales. Elijah's final attempt to make his fortune on the goldfields was at the disastrous Port Curtis gold rush in Queensland. Having failed at gold prospecting, Elijah arrived in Newcastle in September 1858, about a year after his arrival in Australia, where he soon obtained work as a coal miner at one of the old glebe tunnels where George Stone was now working. It cannot be known for certain how Elijah met his future wife, but the mines at the glebe may have put him in contact with his future father-in-law, Alexander Brown, born in Wallsend, Northumberland, England in 1803. Alexander was working for his cousin, Alexander Brown, born in Wallsend, Northumberland, England in 1806 and dying in 1883 in Sydney, who was heavily involved with the Glebe and Dudley mines, as well as those in the Wallsend area. On the 26th of June 1859, 9 months after he arrived in Wallsend, Elijah married Margaret Brown at Christchurch, Newcastle. Margaret was recorded as a 20-year-old spinster. Although Elijah was closer to 26, he declared that he was a 22-year-old bachelor and did not identify himself as a widower. George Stone, Elijah's friend, and Alexander Brown, Margaret's father, were the witnesses. By the date of the marriage, Elijah would have been very aware of Margaret's extended family connections and would have realised that such a marriage was very advantageous. It must be considered that the Browns were the reason Elijah would become so involved in public affairs. Whatever the reason, Elijah rose to the occasion of civic leadership. Elijah and Margaret initially lived south of Newcastle, where he worked in mines in the Dudley area, but by February 1862 they had moved to and settled in Wallsend, where their family grew. On arrival in Wallsend, Elijah was employed by his wife's uncle, Alexander Brown, promoter and first manager of the Newcastle Wallsend Coal Company, to undertake early work in the A Pit, later the Ellamore Vale Colliery. His marriage to Brown's niece had made him a member of the extended Brown family, and he remained in the employ of the Newcastle Wallsend Coal Company until his retirement from mining in 1894. In the 5 years after they married, Elijah and Margaret sponsored the assisted immigration of the members of Elijah's immediate family. The first to arrive aboard the Annie Wilson in 1862 was Elijah's sister and brother-in-law, Anne and Frederick Parks, and their family. Frederick Parks and later Anne Parks held the licence of the Grapes Inn in Wallsend. Elijah's father Thomas, his second wife and her children, and Elijah's brother William Abell and his family arrived as assisted immigrants aboard the Queen of the East in 1864. Much of Elijah's contribution to the community was outlined in a retirement interview in the Newcastle Morning Herald and Miners Advocate on the 6th of October 1894. He took a very active part in the progress of Wallsend, serving as an alderman for 24 years and serving for 4 terms as Mayor of Wallsend in 1882, 1884, 1886 and 1894. Elijah continued to serve the community after he had left the mines, and he retired from the Wallsend Council in February 1899. He was active in the Wallsend and Lambton cooperative societies, and for a period of 20 years held the position of chairman of the board of directors. For 12 of those years, he was the general chairman. He was also a director of the Lambton Building Society from the time it opened until the society closed. Elijah and his nephew Elijah Abell, the son of his brother William, were masons and members of the Lodge Lord Carrington, Wallsend. The two Elijahs served together on the Wallsend Council as mayor and council clerk in 1884. Elijah was secretary of the Wallsend and Plattsburgh Agricultural Show Society. At the yearly show, he won prizes with his flowers and fruit, and Margaret won prizes for her preserved fruit. Elijah worked for the rights of miners and was instrumental in establishing Wallsend Park by facilitating the combined action of the municipal councils of Wallsend and Plattsburgh. Elijah's house on the corner of Brown and Brooks Streets in the area once known as New Ballarat overlooked the park. In 1887, Elijah approached the New South Wales government for a grant of 9 acres of parkland on the estate of Mr. Spears at Lake Macquarie, specifically for the use of the miners of the Wallsend and Lambton areas. In 1888, the Spears Point Park was proclaimed public parkland, and the governor appointed Elijah one of the trustees, a position he held until 1906, when the park became vested in the Lake Macquarie Shire Council, leaving a lasting legacy for the people of Newcastle and Lake Macquarie. Elijah died on the 23rd of July 1913. His funeral left from his house on the corner of Brooks and Brown Streets for the Wallsend Cemetery on Sandgate Road, where he was buried with Margaret, who had predeceased him. Elijah's memory and legacy lived on through his descendants and their continued service to their local communities as representatives, teachers, and nurses. From his somewhat inauspicious beginnings, descendants must wonder whether the Abell family would have achieved what it did without Elijah's strength of character, his concerted effort, but also with the connections of his wife, Margaret Brown. Elijah had married very well. Margaret Brown was the only daughter of Alexander Brown, born in 1803 and died in Wallsend, New South Wales in 1878, and his wife Anne Wilkinson, born in 1808 and died in Northumberland in 1843. Margaret had been born in Wallsend, Northumberland in 1838. On the 7th of November 1857, she arrived in Melbourne as a cabin passenger aboard the South Carolina with her twice-widowed father. Travelling with them was Richard Fryer, born in 1837 and died in Katoomba in 1891. Richard and Alexander were recorded on the indent as miners. After leaving the South Carolina, the 3 passengers immediately travelled to Sydney aboard the coastal steamer the Wonga Wonga, which left Melbourne on the 8th of November. From there they came directly to Newcastle. Alexander was the son of Robert Brown, born in Northumberland in 1771, and Margaret Wilson, born in about 1771, and was the grandson of Alexander Brown and Mary Bell. Although not identified as a relative on the South Carolina indent, Richard Fryer was the son of Elizabeth Major and Robert Fryer. Elizabeth was the daughter of Richard and Martha Major, née Brown, and was a granddaughter of Alexander Brown and Mary Bell. Richard Fryer was therefore Alexander's nephew and Margaret's cousin. In 1863, Robert Brown, 1836 to 1895, Margaret's brother, sponsored by Elijah Abell, arrived aboard the Hotspur. Richard Fryer's sister, Margaret Fryer, also sponsored by Elijah, arrived aboard the Ida. It is possible that other family members, as well as members of the Wilkinson family, also arrived in New South Wales and are still unidentified. Margaret and Elijah Abell had 8 children, 3 sons and 5 daughters, and all were still living when Margaret died on the 27th of May, 1902, at the age of 63. Her daughter Lydia Abell, a nurse, had cared for her mother during her final illness. Margaret's obituary was published in the Newcastle Morning Herald and Miners Advocate on the 28th of May 1902. She had lived in Wallsend for 42 years and was held in the greatest esteem throughout the community for her cheerful and benevolent disposition, being ever ready to assist in promoting movements for the benefit of the sick and suffering. She was buried in Wallsend Cemetery on Sandgate Road, Birmingham Gardens, and Elijah was buried with her when he died in 1913. A headstone was erected. 2 family stories made their way down to the descendants of Alexander's only surviving children, Margaret and her brother Robert. Access to DNA, as well as improved availability and greater breadth of national and international records, have verified both these stories and show how individual arrivals of members of the Brown family were connected to an extended family already in New South Wales. A story passed down to family researchers by Abell descendants confirmed that Margaret's father, Alexander Brown, had come to New South Wales to work for the Newcastle Wallsend Coal Company when it opened in 1859. Alexander was still in the company's employ as weighman when he died on the 15th of August 1878. He was buried in the old Wallsend Cemetery, situated between Thomas Street and Newcastle Road, Wallsend, land provided by the Newcastle Wallsend Coal Company for a cemetery. It is very difficult to explain why, if Alexander and presumably his nephew Richard Fryer came to work for the Newcastle Wallsend Coal Company, they had arrived in 1857, more than a full year before the Newcastle Wallsend Coal Company began. They did not arrive as assisted immigrants, but as cabin passengers. They had moved immediately and directly from Melbourne to Sydney and then on to Newcastle, so there was purpose in their travel. The 2 men must have known or been very confident that the expense they undertook to travel to Australia was worthwhile and that they were guaranteed jobs with the Newcastle Wallsend Coal Company once they arrived. It may also be that their voyage was subsidised or paid for by relatives already here. The Newcastle Wallsend Coal Company was begun by Alexander Brown in 1859 after years of planning. It is now known that the connection between these people with the surname Brown was not coincidence. A further story passed down to the descendants of Margaret's brother Robert Brown supported the idea of a family connection and explained why Robert had moved to Sydney after marrying and spending the early years after his arrival in Newcastle. Robert's descendants recalled that he had left Newcastle specifically to work for Alexander Brown in Brown's new venture as the proprietor of the Piedmont Ironworks. Family stories had told them that Brown was, quote, some kind of cousin. This Alexander Brown, born in 1806 and died in Sydney in 1883, is often referred to as Big Brown and had been employed by the Australian Agricultural Company in the 1830s from Northumberland, England. He had arrived in New South Wales in 1837 aboard the James Watt and went straight to work. Brown should not be, but frequently is, confused with the Scottish immigrant of the same name who operated mines with his brother James as J and A Brown, both in cooperation with Big Brown, but also independently. Big Brown is credited with naming the Newcastle suburb of Wallsend after his birthplace, He married Margaret Steele, and Brown Street, Newcastle, is frequently identified as named after him. While this attribution is questionable, there is no doubt that Brown Street, Wallsend, was named in his honour. Big Brown was the son of Alexander Brown and Hannah Wilkinson, and had been born in Wallsend, Northumberland, England, in 1806. His father was another son of Alexander Brown and Mary Bell, so Big Brown was a cousin to Margaret Brown's father, Alexander. Margaret Brown, Robert Brown, Richard Fryer, and Margaret Fryer were his nieces and nephews. Big Brown had almost certainly returned to England during the late 1840s to visit his parents, Alexander and Hannah, who in 1841 were living next door to Richard Fryer's parents. There is little doubt that while he was in Northumberland, Alexander investigated the possibility of bringing family members and other trustworthy and knowledgeable workers to New South Wales to assist him in his many industrial ventures. Communication lines were probably established during this visit to England. Using family to ensure business loyalty and security was a strategy that had been undertaken by the Steele family, whose daughter Alexander had married. There is no doubt that the Browns did the same thing. Alexander Brown died in 1883 in Sydney and was buried in the Brown family crypt in Waverley Cemetery. He contributed hugely to the industrial history of Australia. Big Brown is rarely given the credit and recognition he deserves, as researchers too often confuse him with the Scottish Alexander Brown, who was born in 1816 and who died in Maitland in 1877. He is buried in Maitland, and he never married. The family connections encouraged by Big Brown were almost certainly to the benefit of all. Margaret Abell's father, Alexander Brown, had the security of a job for life provided by his cousin, also named Alexander Brown. Elijah Abell was married to Brown's niece, was securely employed and active in the local and mining communities. Robert Brown followed Big Brown to Sydney, where he worked in Brown's venture at Piedmont Ironworks. Richard Fryer went on to manage the mining concerns established by Brown in Lithgow. DNA connections between all these families are still apparent in the descendants of the Abells, Browns and Fryers after more than 200 years. So not only am I the 2 times great-granddaughter of Elijah Abell and Margaret Brown, I am the 5 times great-granddaughter of Alexander Brown and Mary Bell.
And that brings us to the end of today's podcast in this series of Notable Novocastrians. It's evident that Elijah and Margaret Abell played a vital role in shaping the Wallsend community. From Elijah's early involvement in mining and the rights of workers to his influential work as a 4-term mayor, his lasting contributions continue to impact the Newcastle and Lake Macquarie regions to this day. Margaret's contributions were no less significant, being an active member of the Wallsend community and advocate for those less fortunate. Newcastle Family History Society has an extensive collection of reference books about coal mining in its library, including publications specifically about the Newcastle Wallsend Coal Company by Ed Tonks, Paul Duggan and the Coalfields Heritage Group. Our catalogue may be downloaded from our website nfhs.org.au. Thank you for tuning in, and be sure to join us again as we uncover more stories of people who shaped our communities on Newcastle Family History Society podcasts.